Welcome to the Filmlings Podcast,
A weekly podcast where we analyze all that goes into effective filmmaking.
I'm Jonathan,
And I'm Alex.
and this is week 35, Meta Musicals.
So how are you doing this week, Jonathan?
I'm doing good, Alex. We're getting into something new. After 35 episodes, there is a genre that we have not discussed yet, and that's musicals.
Yeah. So we figured it's about time that we dive into the storied past of the musical in cinematic history and look at it at 3 different time periods and see what it's all about and see what we can learn from it and what makes a musical so, musical besides the music.
Yeah, and we picked 3, because there are so many musicals and so many classic musicals, but we picked 3 that are pretty well known or significant for very various reasons. And through that, we also got this little through line of what is called the, quote, backstage musical, which is a musical about show business, whether that be about movies or about musicals or just some kind of production. That's what we have in all 3 of our movies this week.
Right, so let's talk about a little bit about the history of the musical, and we have a really great resource for you guys this week from Filmmaker IQ. We're going to post that video for you along with this vlog if you want to take a look at it in depth, but we're going to paint the broad strokes of it here, of the history of the musical, before we dive into our individual musicals, just so you guys can kind of follow along with it for the sake of this conversation. So the musical was a very natural extension on film of the rise of sound technology around the 1920s, and the big breakout musical in the first sound picture that was a big deal, although not the first sound picture, was Al Jolson in The Jazz Singer from 1927. And from there, the musical was kind of born and became a genre in cinema. It was obviously already a genre on stage, but this was its first chance on the silver screen. And it would go on to have many different versions of what a musical was.
Yeah, and the first big wave after there was a huge wave of musicals because suddenly it became very profitable to put music and dancing on screen because now we have sound and we can do that. But the amount of content that was put out about movie musicals kind of made the genre burn out really quickly, like within a couple years. But a couple years later, there were some people who kind of innovated the genre, specifically Busby Berkeley, who was an amazing director of musicals. And we'll be looking at one film that he choreographed today. But he made these kind of kaleidoscopic dance numbers, a lot of aerial shots, just some really beautiful arrangements of dancers and songs and stuff like that. And then as far as the actual dancing talent, Fred Astaire and Ginger Rogers kind of were put together in one movie, and everyone realized, hey, these guys are really good dancers, exceptionally talented, and they have great chemistry together. And so they became the stars of many movies after that and actually launched the golden era, and that comes around the time of our first film, also 42nd Street, which we'll talk about.
Right, and then, of course, Fred and Ginger and the Busby Berkeley movies really dominated most of the 30s, or all of the 30s, and kind of the early part of the 40s, and then MGM kind of started just dominating the scene with their big Technicolor masterpieces of the 40s and 50s. And Louis B. Mayer, who is a very interesting character, and go check out the series on You Must Remember This About Him if you want to learn more about this era of MGM musicals. Free plug of the week, folks. Really promoted the MGM musical as the big moneymaker of the studio, and it was the big blockbuster of its era. It was really what drew audiences in and made money for the studio. So a lot of time and effort went into them, and we really see that today in our second film, Singing in the Rain, which is from this era, and is a big Technicolor musical masterpiece.
So after this golden era of musical history, we get Rodgers and Hammerstein come into the mix, and they start bringing the importance of kind of plot-driven musicals with films like Oklahoma and The Sound of Music. And then, after some of those films come out, then studios kind of start just taking Broadway hits and putting them on film, and to limited degrees of success, because the theater musical market was very different than the film musical market, and a lot of those musicals already had such a huge following on the stage, and they weren't as well received once you put them on film. And thrown into this is also what's called book musicals, where certain books and things are turned into musicals, like think Mary Poppins and that kind of thing. And at this point, kind of fast forwarding to today, there is much less emphasis in movie musicals on actual musical talent, and a lot of times it's very star driven, and it's a lot of pre-existing material being made into musicals rather than new material being made for film musicals. And we are kind of taking the movies that we're watching today through the very beginning to very modern, and we're going to try and look at all of this in three big nutshells.
Right, so our first film today is going to be 42nd Street, as we might have already mentioned, from 1933. This is before the Hays Code was really implemented very strictly, so keep that in mind as we talk about it. And it was nominated for the Best Picture, although it did not win.
Yeah, and 42nd Street is kind of considered the first big film musical, the first backstage musical kind of a thing. And I think Busby Berkeley's first big musical, and we'll talk about all of that. And then we jump forward to 1952 with the ever more classic Singing in the Rain, which was nominated for Best Score and maybe something else, but it did not get definitely not as much attention as it gets nowadays. And we'll talk about some of that.
It is definitely now considered one of the best musicals of the era, and by many, the best musical of all time. But our final film today is La La Land from 2016. It won Best Actress, Best Directing, Best Cinematography, Best Original Song, Best Score, Best Production Design, and Best Picture this year.
Oh, wait. I'm sorry, Alex. Actually, Moonlight won Best Picture last year.
Oh, dang. Right. Man, we must be like the 1,000th people to make that joke, but I think it's still funny. Anyway, so La La Land is a very, I think, controversial movie among
all audiences,
cinephiles,
yeah.
and especially, all audiences, but especially among cinephiles, I think. And we'll get into what might be a heated discussion about that. We shall see. But first, we have other movies to talk about.
Yes, we do. So let's take it back to 1933 and talk about 42nd Street. Alex, go for it.
Okay, so 42nd Street is about stuff. Actually, I'm kidding. I do know what it's about, but do keep in mind while I explain this plot that it was very common of this era to have music and then kind of just build the plot around the music. But that plot that was built around the music for this movie concerns the making of a Broadway play by I don't want to say struggling producer or slash director, but definitely one who has a lot on the line. He doesn't have the reputation he wants. He needs the money, and he also has a medical condition. He has some kind of weird stress that he takes random medication for that's never really explained because we don't need to know the details. But it's been made very clear to him that making this play might kill him, but he just has to do it. And of course, we have all of our cast members, assortment of comedy relief chorus girls, who actually features Ginger Rogers, which I find very fascinating.
Right, as not one of the major roles.
As not one of the major roles. This is before a big breakout with Fred Astaire. We also have a spoiled starlet who used to be on the vaudeville circuit and has found her way off of it by finding her sugar daddy, who is the underwriter of the play, and there's some conflict that comes into play with that. But her boyfriend from the vaudeville times is also hanging around, which you can guess how much conflict that causes as they try to make the play. And we also have it's more of an ensemble, really, but if somebody would be our plucky protagonist, it would be this plucky showgirl who is played by Ruby Keeler, who was a leading lady on Broadway for a long time, actually married to Al Johnson from of jazz singer fame, who starts off as a plucky showgirl who eventually has to step up in a big way for the show on opening night, and it kind of all comes together in a very interesting way. And I think both you and I, Jonathan, had a very similar reaction when we watched this film for the first time, which for the first half kind of went, "This is a musical?" Question mark.
Actually, maybe more than half. Yeah, it was a lot of. So where's the music?
Yeah. I didn't want to be like, I always, because definitely before this week, I'm not like a musical aficionado, and I think I watched a lot of musicals this week, guys, besides just the one in the ones in this podcast. But I didn't want, I had a bit of imposter syndrome going on. I didn't want to be like, where's the music? And everybody in the audience is like, ha, you silly noob. The music in musicals don't come until the end. But I think that was a pretty valid reaction to be like, where's the music?
Yeah, so one of the unique things about this film in terms of the way that you traditionally think about musicals is that it doesn't use music embedded into the plot or to kind of further the emotional development. It's literally a movie about making a musical, and then the last 45 to 30 minutes of the film are the musical, and then you get all the musical numbers kind of put there at the end, sort of detached from the story, but the story has culminated into it, so you know what's at stake for the performers. And the music does relate on some meta level to the actual story in terms of just it being kind of a romantic musical and a romantic story, and so some of those themes overlap, but it wasn't like directly pulling things. I thought that there was going to be a moment where, you know, the actress who's singing the words that relates to her actual personal situation kind of stops and realizes that she actually means them, but there really wasn't that. It was just, we see the musical, and it was great, and it was very flashy, but it's a different experience than what we're used to, because the only other points of music are seeing the rehearsal, and you're seeing some of the dancing in the rehearsal in montages, and you're seeing some of the songs being sung, but it wasn't embedded into the plot at all.
Right. I stopped at one point because I was so confused to look up a list of musical numbers in this play, and a lot of those rehearsal numbers are listed as musical numbers in this movie.
Interesting, because they're not full.
Because they're not full, and they're flawed, and they're exactly what they are. They're rehearsals, they're practice, which is important to the story that we watch and to keeping the story entertaining. That they're not perfect right off the bat, but it is a odd experience to watch. 80 years after the fact to try to understand. And I haven't seen a lot of musicals from this era, but I would definitely think that it is still something that the film musical is trying to figure out, is how to structure a plot, or even just how to structure where you put the music numbers in a movie. Because the modern day thinking is, if you're going to make a musical, you hit them hard and you hit them fast with the music right off the bat, and you keep it coming every so often to keep people interested.
Right.
But maybe that wasn't around yet, because
and maybe that's part of the appeal for this, because again, this comes after this huge inundation of musicals, and people just got burnt out on them. So maybe that's part of the appeal is the fact that you get a story and you get the music thrown in. It doesn't feel like it's using the music as a ploy or as kind of just fan service to feed you the sound. It feels like, okay, it's actually kind of about something, and then we also get the visual feast at the end, which there definitely is with the Busby Berkeley choreography.
Oh, yeah. It really sneaks up on you too, because at that point I had kind of been like, are we gonna see anything? And I think that's a very common reaction. That's why I keep mentioning those. But it sneaks up on you, and then there's just all this eye candy all at once right at the end, which is great. It's a really spectacular finale, and it leaves you feeling like, oh, that was a great movie, which definitely worked because I don't know if we've mentioned it or connected these dots yet in verbatim, but the 42nd Street movie really relaunched the movie musical golden era throughout the 30s, 40s, and 50s after this slump that we've been talking about. And it was a bad slump. It was like literally movies were advertised as featuring no music, like to get audiences to come see them. And 42nd Street brought that all back, and everyone was all like, oh yeah, musicals, let's go see those. And launched Busby Berkeley's career, and all that. So it was a big deal, and it leaves you feeling very, very satisfied, very, very fun. But I also think it's important to mention that about that eye candy at the end is that when we talk about film as spectacle, musical is like the farthest on that scale. Like it is as close as you could get to film as spectacle as being the primary goal of film.
Because you get certain departures from reality that are granted to you in a musical that aren't in other types of drama. And we're going to see that just kind of be accentuated more and more in each of the films that we watch. But there are certain elements in 42nd Street where, the musical that we're watching at the end could not have been put on as a staged play as it is kind of spoken about in the film, because it pretty much only works from looking at it straight above at certain points. And
so that choreography would look really weird on stage.
Yeah, so there's some interesting kind of disconnect there where they're putting on this musical, they're kind of putting it under the pretense of it being a staged musical in the movie, but really it's a musical for the film audience primarily. Yeah.
And it definitely, in that sense, it definitely kind of tosses realism out the window. I mean, they were constrained by what they could technically do. Like, they didn't have CGI at their disposal. So what we're getting feels like it has a dose of realism to modern audiences. Because it's not like, one of the other musicals we've watched on this podcast before. It's not like Bahubali, which has like CGI tossed in on the spectacle, so it all feels very fantastical. But it is fantastical for the era in 42nd Street, and even nowadays it's hard to look at it and be like, wow, this is pure spectacle eye candy, and I love it.
And there was definitely. There was a good point in that Filmmaker IQ video that you mentioned earlier that I hadn't thought of, because I was thinking about this weird disconnect. But another part of it from the time period is that making the musical specific to film in a way that the only way you can actually experience this musical that we're seeing in the proper way is for it to be filmed with the camera following or the camera looking straight down or whatever. And that adds an element to this film that you couldn't go see this movie on Broadway. So that makes it an exclusive experience to film-going audiences, which is kind of a special thing and is also another draw for this film. And I think this is one of the first films that kind of had that appeal because of one of Busby Berkeley's innovations, which was to disconnect the camera from the recording of the audio, which had huge advantages. Do you want to talk about that, Alex?
Yeah. So we're still in the very early days of sound technology, and cameras haven't fully caught up yet. And by that I mean they're still really freaking loud. So a lot of times, if you wanted to shoot sync sound and picture at the same time, you had to put the camera in a soundproof box, which could be a problem, obviously, if you want to try to do the kind of camera moves that Busby Berkeley pulls off with his choreography. But if you pre-record the musical number and play it back as the actors do their thing so they can perform properly, and then just sync up the pre-recorded audio and the re-recorded, or not re-recorded, the properly recorded camera movements with the super loud camera going but no sound rolling on the super loud camera, then you have exactly what you want. You have the pre-recorded sound and the well-done cinematography meshed into a brilliant piece on screen, which is something you can only do in film. But by doing the pre-recorded sound, Busby Berkeley was able to pull off his famous top-down shots, which he just does out the wazoo in 42nd Street. Like sincerely amazing. And I feel like we should post. You found a really cool video of Busby Berkeley shots, kind of a nice compilation to really give you a full sense of what they look like, and we can post that along with the blog post this week to give you a quick taste of what they're like. And I'm sure after you see them, you'd be anxious to see some of these musicals, because they really are spectacular.
Yeah, and I mean, it's still some unparalleled just shot composition and stuff that you don't even see in a lot of movies today, except for like extremely artsy, like people trying very hard to get the same kind of a feel, because just the amount of production design that goes into making these, because it's taking a whole sound studio, and some of the shots in the compilation that we'll post and from the movies that he made, which you should definitely look into, just require so many props and so many people and so much very precise choreography and movement that it's incredible how much planning goes into them, and they definitely pay off. And they're still being homaged today, and I think we see homages to Busby Berkeley in probably both of the films that we watched today. And there's even an homage to the scene where the camera goes underneath the legs of a bunch of chorus girls and then reveals the faces of the two main actors in the musical. And I think there's a reference to that in the Big Lebowski, of all things. So there's just all of these really innovative images and choreographies are still having their impact even today, close to 100 years later.
You know what's kind of interesting? We were talking last week on the Frank Capra episode about how he used pre-recorded sound as innovation to make his films better. And now we're talking about it again this week. So it's only fitting we also talk about the Hays Code a little, because who doesn't like talking about the Hays Code?
Right.
And like we talked about last week, the Hays Code was around before 1934, but it wasn't really enforced until 1934. So there were rules, they were all broken. And they were broken in 42nd Street, but in the style that you'd expect a 1933 movie to break them.
There's still a different kind of default propriety level than we have today, but it for the time period, there are some things in this film that probably wouldn't fly a couple years later. For example, there was a lot of drinking and drunkenness. There's a whole very pivotal scene where a bunch of the actresses in the musical are very drunk, and just all these kind of shenanigans happening in this hotel room. And then also there's a very creepy producer guy that you mentioned in the overview who is kind of interested in the musical because of the girls and the dancers in it. And one of the actresses in the musical is only in it because she has a relationship with him, and that's not very subtle in the movie either. And it's this kind of interesting breach of propriety that is probably one of the things that kind of made the Hays Code come into effect, and probably some of the shots of the dancing and stuff. There's a lot of legs in this movie. And so it's interesting seeing some of the things that are happening before the Hays Code, and then some of the things that are similar but start to become implied a couple years later.
Yeah, and this isn't like the raunchiest of movies, but it is a good example of that kind of flip flop, because the Hays Code was a big deal in the movies, and like we talked about last week, it restricted them in a lot of ways, but that also led to a lot of creativities in another way. And it might be worth exploring in its own mini set of episodes at one point in time. But for now, it's just kind of the fun thing to keep in mind while you watch these films. Not just the films that were made or how they were made, but the circumstances in which they were made, because those often reveal more about the film than you would expect. And one other thing I want to mention before we leave 42nd Street to go Singin' in the Rain is this idea that, or this tension between the spectacle required to make a musical enjoyable and the reality or the realism that can be in a film, or the realism that is expected of a film of any given era. And obviously in 42nd Street, you don't expect a lot of realism. Movies are fantasy, movies are spectacle, and Busby Berkeley movies especially are all about spectacle. And whether or not it's very realistic is kind of, neither here nor there. But it is something that just to keep in the back of your mind as this episode progresses, because we are going to see a slight transition as we go forward. And I feel like that's a big question for me today in regards to these musicals and just the genre as a whole, as to whether or not a musical can be both realistic and satisfactory, spectacular at the same time. We'll have to see. So, Jonathan, do you want to set us up for Singing in the Rain, 1952?
Yes, I do. Although this is one of the films that we talk about on the podcast that probably does not need an introduction. Singing in the Rain is so just ubiquitously loved as a film and as a musical and just as classic cinema history. But essentially, it follows the story of Hollywood transitioning to sound on one level, and two characters, Don Lockwood and Lena Lamont, who are gigantic silent film stars, and what happens when they have to start incorporating dialogue and speaking into their films, especially because Lena has the worst voice any person could have, and it would definitely not attract audiences. And also we have Don Lockwood's best friend and musical composer, Cosmo, and then the choir girl that Don runs into named Kathy Selden, and how she is much more talented but hasn't gotten the big break that Lena has. And eventually they concoct this plan for Kathy to voice Lena in all of her movies because she has a much better voice, and the tension that creates and the egos that go flying and the love that blossoms between Don and Lena. And then, of course, all the music, whether it's, needed to the story or not, but it just all goes into this big, wonderful mishmash of music and story that is Singing in the Rain.
And very bright colors, which I
yes,
quite enjoyed.
And colors.
and there's a very big difference between 42nd Street and Singing in the Rain, and very typical of the MGM musicals of this era, like the 40s and the 50s, when MGM was musical king.
Following on Wizard of Oz and stuff like that.
Yeah. And they just dominated with musicals exactly like this, with musicals that were fun and bright and had excellent music and lots of star power and lots of production quality too. Because there are one or two segments in Singing in the Rain that, wow, sometimes when I look at them, all I see is just dollar signs. Like, that must have been so expensive, and so hard to shoot. But dang, does it look good? And also, keep in mind another thing that was pretty typical of this era was, or at least any original movie musicals of the time, was that the music was written and then the plot was written. Which, considering that, the plot is really good in this film.
Yeah. And real quick, before we get too far from 42nd Street, I think one of the interesting things about Singing in the Rain that you mentioned is how colorful it is. And how colorful, especially the montage of transitioning from silent to talkies, where the movie is telling us that the whole film industry is transitioning into this new talking era where musicals are going to become this gigantic thing. Everything that we just saw that literally happened right before 42nd Street in Hollywood. And this is like barely 2 decades later. So this is actually not that far distant from the time period it's portraying. But that sequence is so colorful, and all the musicals, the first musical number that we see them filming on the lot is Beautiful Girls, and he's describing all of these costumes that are so colorful and everything. And all I could think was that, if they're filming this in this time period, it's going to be black and white. So they're not actually going to get the colors across. That's just for us, the film audience, watching Singing in the Rain, in the same way that filming the musical on the stage in 42nd Street is just for the film audience. So there's this interesting kind of, again, this break from reality that you can get away with in musicals, but you don't really think about it until you start breaking down the logistics of what's actually happening.
Oh gosh, you know what that reminds me of? And I nearly forgot, but there's one line very early in 42nd Street when somebody's looking for somebody on stage and it's pure chaos. And what the person who points out who our plucky showgirl is looking for says, "Oh yeah, it's the guy over there in the green hat." And I'm like, "What? This is a black and white film. What are you doing?" And maybe it's just because color film wasn't a thing yet, so people weren't like, "Oh, well, it's black and white." People will be like, "What's the point of saying that?" But seriously, like, color is completely irrelevant when you are in a black and white film. So
yeah, and that wasn't. I mean, it's not like a big plot point revolved around the audience knowing that he's in a green hat. But yeah, that's interesting.
No, not at all. It was a very minor line. It was just a little annoyance of mine, but there it is.
Yeah.
But yeah, I also want to take a moment to just mention the how interesting this period of history is, and how weirdly connected to reality this musical is, in the sense that, like, a lot of stars did struggle to make that transition between sound between silent pictures and sound pictures. And like the dilemma that our starlet at the beginning faces, where she has a terrible voice. I don't want to say terrible like in a mean way, but like definitely not suited for creating pleasing scenes on screen that are
the character intentionally had a terrible voice. I think we can say that. Even though the actress did not. She had a normal voice.
She had a fantastic voice. She actually sings a lot of her own parts that are supposedly dubbed by Debbie Reynolds over the course of the film. And in fact, one of the scenes where it's in, and I apologize that this sounds so confusing because it is, but one of the scenes where she is dubbing her voice for a music number is actually dubbed by a third actress. So I was trying to read the IMDb note on it, and it was just impossible to follow. It was like X actress is filming Z actress's scene while Y actress is dubbing this actress dubbing that actress, and I'm like, what?
Wow.
But again, these are complicated, definitely big productions that went into it.
Yeah, and one of the other parallels to reality is Debbie Reynolds. She makes this movie when she's 19. This is her first big role. She is dancing with Gene Kelly and Donald O'Connor, some of the greatest dancers of their time or any time. And that's kind of what her character is. She's thrown into this world of, celebrity giants and has to cope with that and kind of put on her big girl pants and dance with the with the masters. And she does it. And we have an interview that we'll throw in the notes where she talks about how hard it was. And it was hard, but she worked on it and she worked hard. And I think that her part holds up with these other characters and actors who are so just well trained and so great at what they do. And she jumped in and fits into this story perfectly.
Yeah, it's all the more impressive because Gene Kelly was notorious for being very demanding on set, and sometimes very harsh to his co-stars. And for a 19-year-old kid to jump in there and make arguably one of the best films of all time, and I would say one of the best musicals of all time, if not the best musical of all time, is pretty damn impressive. And the whole shoot was very, it's very high profile. It's very stressful because this is the middle of the MGM Golden Era. But the stars really pulled through. In fact, the entire Singing in the Rain number, the big famous one where Gene Kelly is splashing around on a street, which is a backlot, by the way, if you didn't know. He has like 100-degree fever for that entire thing, and they had only half choreographed the entire number, and he was like, let's roll on it and see what happens. And they got it in one take, and that's what you see in the final film. Sorry, wait, I'm getting the word. That was a mistake. That was a myth. They did not shoot it in one take. They shot it over the course of a few days, but he did have a fever, which is very impressive to shoot that on. And wow, we really have to clean up this whole note delivery system. First Moonlight, and now this. Jonathan, what is the Filmings podcast coming to?
Yeah, the envelopes and little note cards, it's really about the typography, but we should probably find a better system.
And one of the things I love about this movie is because I am a cinephile, which means a movie lover, if you didn't know. I feel like that's fairly obvious, but whatever. I am a cinephile. Jonathan, you are a cinephile, yes?
Yes.
Yes, and you know what cinephiles love?
Movies.
You know what they really like?
Movies about movies.
They love movies about movies. Everyone's so confused why or so upset that Hollywood loves Hollywood so much. And I'm like, that's because they're all kids who grew up to love Hollywood and want to be in Hollywood. And wow, they finally made it. And of course they love Hollywood. Like, what? They were all born dreamers, or a lot of them were. I'm sure there's plenty of scumbags and opportunists mixed in among them. Actually, I'm sure there are, but so many of them are dreamers, and of course they love themselves and love the thing that they finally got to be a part of. But another part of that is that Hollywood has done a darn good job of mythologizing itself, of making its own history basically mythical. It is very real, but I mean, mythical in the way that it looks in Singing in the Rain.
Romanticized.
Romanticized. In the opening sequence where all the stars come in, who are all, by the way, parodies of real life stars. And
then became stars themselves later on.
Yeah, it's glorious. It's absolutely glorious. In a very funny, ironic way. But it is something that Hollywood loves to do, and musicals seem very apt at doing it.
Yeah, and that kind of goes into the idea of, as you already mentioned, a lot of the music for this film was already like pre-existing before the film was made. So many of these songs come from other movies and that have already been made, or songs that have been written for movies that maybe hadn't been made. And they kind of went through and pulled them all together and created this story, and it really kind of works. But that's why certain pieces may feel a little bit disjointed. For example, the famous Broadway medley, which is definitely the most memorable piece of this whole movie, where Gene Kelly is pitching this scene to his studio exec, and basically we go into his imagination of this scene, which is the most elaborate number in the whole movie, about this guy coming to Hollywood, coming to Broadway rather, trying to make it big. He goes to every agent and says he's got to dance. And we just go through this whole elaborate, romantic, gorgeous scene that really has no impact on the plot at all. But it has a huge impact on your perception of the movie as a whole because it is so brilliantly executed.
Yeah, it ends up being a work of tone setting and emotion. I don't want to say emotion control, but an emotional arc more than any kind of like real plot
for the
arc
audience,
through the music
yeah.
pieces for the audience, because the musical numbers serve to, man, they just make you happy. That's all I want. Like, they just
what a glorious feeling.
Yeah, really? Yeah, sing it, Jonathan.
I'm not going to sing. We've spared them this far.
Yeah, I think we made the mutual decision beforehand to not sing in this podcast, and that is for your benefit, dear listener. But yeah, they just make you happy, and I think, you know, when I say that the point of a musical is almost entirely spectacle, that's kind of what I mean. Is that you just enjoy watching these musical numbers so much that whether or not the plot around them makes any sense is kind of like Moses Supposes.
Right.
Very enjoyable number. Didn't really serve the plot at all, but man, is it enjoyable.
And that's actually the only song that was actually written for the film, the only new song in the whole movie. But that does go into, because we talked about in the last film that, the music was kind of separated because it was put into the guise of this show within the movie. Whereas in this film, we're seeing what we're more used to, which is songs that pop up in the middle of, what we presume to be reality, even though, as it's been riffed on so many times, that doesn't happen in real life. But this is what musicals have conditioned us to do, is to just believe that somehow the music is just this emotional outlet for the characters, and it's gorgeous and it's beautiful, and especially in films like this where the performers are just so good at their craft that the dancing is just outstanding and everything goes together and you believe it. You believe the emotion of it, even if you don't believe that might actually happen in real life. But, if you're into the story enough, then it doesn't make a difference. And we talked about that, and I think we'll bring up Bollywood again later, but we talked about that with Indian cinema, is that it's so fantastical that it sets itself up to be able to go in whatever direction and you will believe it because it believes in itself so much. And that's really the point.
Yeah, it says this is okay, so the audience just kind of goes with it. As long as
right, because it does it confidently.
Yeah. As long as it follows its own rules, then it's fine. It's when a film starts breaking its own rules that you get confused. But it doesn't matter how crazy those rules are, as long as you stick to them. And the musicals, especially Bollywood musicals, do that very well.
But one other thing we should talk about is the way the film was received when it was released versus the way that it's perceived in modern day, looking back on it, which is interesting because it was not the most well-received musical. It was kind of, it was well-received. People liked it, but it was not the Hollywood mammoth that it is today in the popular imagination. And that's really interesting because I think that it was kind of upstaged by musicals like An American in Paris and some other contemporary films that don't capture the public imagination in the same way that they do today. I mean, these are still regarded as great films, but nothing compares to the legacy that Singing in the Rain has had just in film and everyday life.
Right. I mean, it's pretty common knowledge on the street. Like, if you bring up Singing in the Rain, somebody knows what you're talking about. If you bring up An American in Paris, somebody would be like, why
I've
are
heard
they
that
in Paris?
title. Right.
Which is funny because Gene Kelly's in both, and An American in Paris won the Oscar, while Singing in the Rain did not.
Yeah, and that's kind of what I'm talking about, is that, there's, even if a film is not totally, this is why, the Oscars are such a, kind of contested point of validity as far as, giving validity to the films that get awarded, because can you really say how impactful a film is the year after it comes out? Or does it take 5, 10, 20, 50 years to really understand what films are going to last with people and what films are going to be fun in that year for a time, but then just kind of be forgotten, except for a few select cinephiles who know about the old movies?
Yeah, because critics are regularly wrong, because it's all subjective, and you don't know what's going to be in vogue this year, in vogue next year. And the really impressive stuff is the stuff that stays in vogue all the years, like Singing in the Rain has. And that's why the legacy of this film is so impressive, because it's stuck around, and it's stuck around for a while too. It's been like 60 years, man. Since this movie's come out. It's not a young film at all, and it's still utterly brilliant. I do want to point out one thing that I found very interesting about these golden era musicals from the middle of the century, is that they're kind of star vehicles, but not in the sense that they only exist for the sake of the star in the film, but they are showcases of talent, more so than purely narrative films, I think, because they are there to show off a triple threat. They are there to work that triple threat to its maximum advantage and milk it for its maximum entertainment value. And so you're there not to see Gene Kelly serve the plot, but you're there to see Gene Kelly dance like he's just got to dance, and sing like he's just got to sing, and act like he's just got to act. And you're really there for the performance in these films.
Yeah, and this film and many of the films of this era really deliver, because there are so many performers who were intensely trained in singing and dancing and acting in a way that you don't quite get the same today. But before we move on with that, I think it'd be fun to just bring up another film that is almost a perfect counterpart to Singing in the Rain, which came out fairly recently, and that is The Artist. And that is a film that follows also the transition from silent film to talking film, but it's from the perspective of the silent film. So it is portrayed in a silent film in black and white, and you're seeing the silent film actor trying to cope with this transition, but silently, as opposed to in Singing in the Rain, where we're watching that transition from the perspective of color and talking pictures and using all of that to its maximum effect. So I think that's a really interesting kind of switch. And there's even music in The Artist, kind of the whole musical genre comes up in that. So
yeah. I mean, it literally is silent and black and white. Like, it is the opposite.
Right. And it's, very similar subject matter again. So it's kind of fun. I would love to do a double feature with that. I haven't, but they always stick together in my mind for whatever reason. All right. But getting back into proper musicals, let's talk about the big one that came out very recently that has been getting so much buzz, not only because of its Oscar controversy, which we've been making fun of, but also just general controversy that we'll talk about. And that's La La Land. Alex, set us up.
This is the story of two dreamers, Mia and Sebastian. Mia, played by Emma Stone, wants to be an actress, and Sebastian, played by Ryan Gosling, is a jazz pianist and wants to own his own jazz club someday. And the two eventually meet through a series of happenstances and fall in love and spur each other to achieve their dreams. But will their romance survive? And wow, that plot was kind of easy to sum up. But it is a musical, and it is very much set in modern day LA. It is maybe one of the best examples of modern day LA and like the dreamer scene, as I call it, in modern day LA that I've witnessed. Like those in LA who are aspiring to be in the industry, as they call it, and dream big, like these two dream big. And it is, yes, it is a musical, although there are people who seem to debate whether or not it's a good musical. And I say it's at very least a good movie. And if you say otherwise, you can meet me on the corner. I will fight you. But yeah, that's what this movie is about. And if nothing else, it's a darn good movie about two people who are trying to achieve their dreams in a very modern setting. But whether or not it's a good musical, well, there's a debate.
Yeah, so just to kind of lay out the two different sides, if you will, of the discussion about the film, it kind of falls in the camp of, as we've been talking about, classically musicals are showcasing triple threats, like you just kind of explained for us with the last film, which are performers who are excellent actors, dancers, and singers. Whereas, as I've said, we don't have a whole lot of those, at least not with the same star power that Gene Kelly and Fred Astaire and Ginger Rogers did. So this film has cast two phenomenal actors and basically taught them to sing and dance throughout the film. And whether that plays off as well as it does in the golden era of musicals is kind of where the controversy comes in, and also the fact that the film itself references so many classic movies and so many classic musicals that showcase such talent, and then uses performers who are one or two of the triple threat is kind of disappointing to some people, and that's where this debate comes in.
Yeah. So the reason people like it, why do people like this movie? Well, it is bright, it is full of music, and it is very, very colorful. It matches
and nostalgic.
the Technicolor. It matches the Technicolor pop of the MGM musicals of the 1950s, but shot in such a way that if you play it on a digital screen, you're not going to lose some of that sharpness that you lose when you watch a film movie from the 1950s on a digital screen. And yes, like you say, there is a lot of nostalgia driven here. Not so I didn't have that experience personally because I didn't see a lot of musicals before this week, but I do understand that is there for a lot of people who really love musicals and have seen a lot of them before watching this movie, because Damien Chazelle makes an honest effort to reference as many as possible throughout the course of this film. And there's even a
subtly
line,
or unsubtly.
Yeah, totally unsubtly. It's very over the top. There's even a line in the film when Mia and Sebastian are talking about the play that Mia's written, where she worries about it being too nostalgic, and he says, "That's the point. And if they don't like it, bleep them." or something along those lines. And they're kind of talking more about La La Land at that point than they're talking about the play.
Her play, yeah.
Yeah, they're definitely like, we're having fun with this. We're gonna do it. The big reason why I like it is because it's a dialogue, it's a story, it's a really great plot about the power of dreams and trying to achieve those dreams, and how a romance can fit into those dreams rather than how a dream can fit into the romance, which is how so many films like to take things, is that the romance solves everything, but sometimes dreams get left in the dust. And this kind of takes a different view, and I won't say exactly how it does it. Go watch the film, but it does take a different view, and I very much enjoyed it, and I really liked the message at its core. And of course, like we just mentioned before with Singing in the Rain, Hollywood likes Hollywood. This is a film for a cinephile, those who get the references that are made in it, those who want to be in the industry and understand the dream that is at hand in the film, or those who are already in the industry and understand it, or those who have ever wanted anything so bad that you would move across the country and spend all your time trying to accomplish it.
Yeah, and then on the other side of the argument, there's, like I've already said, some of the performers don't have the same amount of dancing and singing talent that the classical stars did. You can't really top Gene Kelly, but still there's a level of professionalism and technique in the dancing and singing that doesn't translate from people who really love those classic musicals into the modern musicals, because a lot of the dancers and singers who have the talent don't have the acting talent, and also don't have the star pull that studios are willing to bank a lot of money on to make their money back on how much it takes to make a musical these days. And then also, like you brought up the homages and stuff, but some of it is very in your face, which can turn some people off. Maybe they want more subtle references and stuff. And I think there's a good mix in this one of, they literally go see Rebel Without a Cause, and they talk about Casablanca. And these are pretty easy movies to pull and reference. And then there's also more subtle ones where Ryan Gosling does a quick spin around a lamppost, and you get, okay, we got Singing in the Rain in there. And then also the ending, which you kind of alluded to, depending on what you think about the themes in the film, it may be a good ending or a bad ending. So that can turn people one way or another. And there's probably also a lot of the controversy just coming from people who like to push back against a movie that gets a lot of attention. So, if a movie gets liked a lot.
Oh yeah, those people always come out, and I am occasionally one of those people. I'll cop to it. I am occasionally one of those people who's like, oh, it's just all the rage right now. It's not that great. It's just a fad. And then I go see it and form an opinion for myself. But I am guilty of it. So.
Yeah, and then there's the other question of, I guess, the production status as far as the classic musicals being primarily filmed and performed on sound stages where everything is in the director's control. All the lighting, all the set pieces, the mise en scène, which we've talked about before, can all be specifically set up for each musical number, whereas La La Land has a much more indie feel. For example, in the Filmmaker IQ article, he talks about the opening number of La La Land, which is everyone on the Los Angeles highway stuck in traffic gets out and starts dancing on top of the cars. Everyone has very brightly colored cars and colored clothes, and but it's in broad daylight. They actually filmed this in broad daylight, so the shadows are very harsh, and it doesn't look as pristine as some of the classic musicals. And so maybe that's a bit of a hard transition for some people who are going into this expecting one thing and then getting something a little bit different.
Yeah, and a big part of that, that I think we've been not so subtly dropping hints at over the course of this podcast, is that the conditions that have to exist for a musical, the quality of a 1950s musical, have to be similar conditions, or at least better than they currently are. I feel like I'm talking about it like it's a storm. Like there's certain conditions that have to form for a perfect musical storm to happen. Watch out, we have the outflow boundary on this musical number over here, and I hope you're getting used to singing in this rain, because it will be raining for a while. Except it won't, because we don't have the same conditions. And when we talk about La La Land looking like it has an indie budget, I mean, it doesn't have a completely indie budget, but it doesn't have anything like the support that was behind the MGM musicals. They were shooting like out on location, with kind of like what almost felt like, I don't want to say quick and dirty, but a lot of that stuff had to be done in under very tight circumstances. Whereas a lot of the MGM musicals had to be shot on backlots where they had complete control over everything. And so you can have the big dance numbers like you have in Singing in the Rain, where you have complete control over everything, and you have the time, and you have a studio that is okay with letting you take the time to do that. And that studio system that produced that same conditions for production, and also the same studio system that consciously and actively took an effort to find talent that could be a triple threat, and and like cultivate that talent, because that is something the studio system did. Like, that was what they were best at, probably, is creating stars, is finding people who had the talent, because there was plenty of them around trying to be the one who had the talent, and developing that talent and turning them into stars, like Debbie Reynolds. And you don't have that same action happening in Hollywood right now. You don't have the same people who are trying to develop and cultivate this pin of talent. You have a bunch of individuals trying to make stuff, and that's great. And that is great when you're trying to make this realistic stuff that's in the legacy of the new wave of cinema that happened all across the globe in the 60s and 70s and hit America big at that point in time. But we just don't have that right now. So I'm not surprised that La La Land doesn't measure up to the standards of people who expect it to look like a 1950s musical. And I mean, it's not the only musical to come out in the past 2 decades. There's been others, but it's been like the first big singing and dancing musical since like Chicago almost. I'm sure there's some other one out there that I don't know about, but it's been a while.
Yeah, and to its credit, it is original. This is not material that's taken from stage or from previously existing movies, as we've seen a lot of lately, as far as, Into the Woods and all the Disney films that are getting remade in live action. So that it definitely has that going for it, and that is a risk that Damien Chazelle took, and it's definitely a story that he was passionate about, and you have to give him credit for it. So I don't know that there's discussion that it's a bad movie. There's definitely that question of it's referencing such classic work, and then it kind of sets a bar for itself, and people kind of fall in two different camps, whether it rises to that bar or not.
Well, filmmaker IQ guy definitely thinks it's a bad movie.
Right.
He has some very strong feelings about it. But you did bring up this question this week about how films are regarded in their contemporary, their modern setting when they were released, versus what will their legacy be. And I have a take on this. We got lots of hot takes this week on the Films podcast. I have a hot take on this, and that is that if If La La Land launches a new interest in musicals that can foster talent who sets out with the goal of creating movie musicals in their career, then it could one day be seen as the movie that launched or helped launch a new golden age of musicals. And that is possible. That doesn't mean it will happen. It means it's possible.
I definitely agree with that, and I think that that kind of puts it more in a category of 42nd Street that launched the second or the first golden age of the Hollywood musical. And as we talked about, all of the kind of spectacular Busby Berkeley stuff is relegated to the end, so there are more spectacular choreographies and Busby Berkeley films that come afterwards. But this film is significant because it was at the beginning. And I think La La Land could be that because it has a very compelling story. And whether all the technical aspects live up to certain people's expectations, if it does kick off this kind of search for talent who could be put in similar kinds of films but fulfill more of the triple threat kind of role, then I think that La La Land will become a very, very significant film in film history. But only time will tell, and we'll have to see what happens going forwards.
Yeah, and honestly, let's pretend they gave Ryan Gosling and Emma Stone another year to work on their tap dancing, and actually, taken a little more extra time to nail that lighting on the highway scene. And you would have been looking at a much better movie. And I really think it's a really good movie.
And there are scenes, like we talked about the production value, but there are scenes that are very soundstage centric. For example, there's probably the most climactic point, which is kind of an imagination thing, kind of like we talked about with Singing in the Rain. And it definitely harkens back to the Broadway medley. And that's all soundstage. But it feels in some ways smaller than the Singing in the Rain Broadway medley. But that's, again, it goes into what resources are available for these kind of films. What are studios willing to provide to get a film like this made? Because I don't think they believe in it anymore. Public tastes have changed, and the studio's priorities have changed. So we don't have, again, like you said, that seeking for that talent or that providing for these kinds of films because, they haven't been proven to be the next Singing in the Rain yet. So they're not going to back it yet. But we'll see what happens in the future, and hopefully there can be a revitalization of this genre.
Yeah, and La La Land definitely performed well. So
right. It did not do badly. There's just all of this controversy is really just kind of dust in the wind until we see the long-lasting impact in a decade or so.
It's a bunch of cinephiles with their own hot takes trying to convince other cinephiles that their hot take is better than the other hot take. But anyway.
All right, so let's take all of our hot takes and throw them into a big stew of overall notes and talk about musicals in general. And again, we are looking at 3 little blips on the musical history, which spans almost as long as talking film history as we've been talking about. So we'll definitely come back to musicals later, but just from what we've seen this week, what have we observed?
Jonathan, if this was a musical, we would break out into a song right now called Hot Take Stew.
And it would be glorious if we could sing.
It would be glorious. So I think one of the biggest things we've learned this week is that musicals rely heavily on spectacle, and it doesn't matter over much whether or not it matters to whether it's a successful movie. It doesn't matter too much to whether it's a successful musical, how realistic and well thought out and well made the plot is. But the spectacle has to be there if you want to consider it a fantastic musical. And I think that's something that we've noticed in the comparison of all three of our movies this week.
Yeah, and that kind of goes into this idea of escapism. Like, there's an expectation that you go into with a musical that's different from going into a drama or a historical epic or something like that. You're going into this film hoping to be elevated and kind of taken out of everyday life to some extent or another.
Yeah, because nobody goes into a musical and is like, you know what the best part was? The part where they weren't singing.
Right.
And I think that's one of the most impressive things about the genre as a whole, because it gets a lot of credit, obviously, for being fun and being spectacular. But one of the coolest things about it is that it takes advantage of the full range of what a movie can be. It's grand camera movements and grand staging and grand costume design, and it takes full advantage of sight and sound with singing and dancing all at once. And once you have the introduction of color, you have bright colors everywhere. And once you have the introduction of CGI, oh, trust me, there's plenty of CGI. Just go watch Across the Universe. But I think that's one of the most lovable things about a musical, from a cinephile point of view, is that it is such a good example of everything a movie can be, but like all at once. It's literally, what could happen if we turn this movie up to 11? Oh, a musical could happen.
Yeah, and that's, I mean, we're seeing that has been ingrained in the musical just DNA from the very beginning, with Busby Berkeley breaking the camera free of the sound box and being able to use it in conjunction with the choreography. And like you said, it's pushing everything to 11. It's making these emotional moments just kind of pop out at you by adding singing and like things that aren't real, but are kind of what you're feeling when you're in those moments in real life. And that's what we saw in Indian cinema, like we mentioned a little bit before, is that they're not ashamed to throw musicals into every genre of film that they make, whether it's drama or fantasy or whatever. They'll add musical numbers to them, and that's just kind of become a point of Indian cinema. And I think we even mentioned in that episode in the world tour that Hollywood might actually have something to learn from Indian cinema about incorporating music into drama and storytelling. And so we're seeing that this art form is really important and can be very popular across cultures. And there's just something like with the shifting of interpretations and tastes and stuff like that kind of makes American musicals go through these waves of popularity and make these debates happen of the quality of certain musicals that are released.
Yeah, it's like tight pants. They come and go in waves. But there's something nice and global about what makes a musical a musical. I don't have to read subtitles when I'm watching a musical segment of a Bollywood movie. And that's not because like I suddenly understand Hindi. I don't. I wish that happened, but I don't. It's more of that the enjoyment of the scene isn't based off of what they're saying. It's based off of how they sing and how they move. And you can enjoy a foreign song and dance regardless of what language you speak. And it just translates so well across cultures.
Yeah, and there's another element to the modern age of Hollywood, is that in the last several decades, Hollywood has put a real premium on making films feel very realistic, and even to the point where hyper-realism is a word used to describe the feeling of performances and just atmospheres in films. And I think that's another thing that goes into the La La Land discussion, is that, like you've been saying, that musicals are supposed to be fantastical and very big and bright and surreal in some ways. And the state of current Hollywood films is kind of contrary to that because it's too close and personal in some ways. So I don't know if we just haven't found the right mixture of contemporary cinematography and filmmaking and the fantastic musical feel or what, but that might be another element that goes into that conversation.
I'm sure it's doable because, like I said before, and this isn't to knock on Ryan Gosling and Emma Stone. They're both wonderful performers, but they weren't the right. I mean, they're not triple threats, is what I'm getting at.
Right.
And like, imagine if you had the same exact film, but with like Gene Kelly and Debbie Reynolds in it. Like, it would have been a very different film. And you would have, obviously, I'm talking about 1950s versions, like not the old ones. It would have been a very different film if you had the triple threats in it. I think it would have worked, and I think you could have pulled off that mix between realism and fantasy to a certain extent, because, and part of that is because the realistic elements in La La Land deal with how we really treat the fantasy in our own lives, like how we treat these fantasies, these dreams we chase after, which made it a very suitable topic to attack this modern musical dilemma that we face. And I don't see any future in which Damien Chazelle doesn't try to make another musical at some point in his life. So I hope his next attempt is even better. And maybe if he uses the same actors again, they'll have had a few more classes.
Yeah, and Damien Chazelle made Whiplash a couple years ago. So both of his big films, he's a fairly new name right now, but both of his films revolve heavily around music and, the kind of clash of dream chasing and what that really means when you get down to the nitty gritty of it. So it will be very interesting to see what comes in the future. And it'll be also interesting to see just the future of the musical in general. And I know that there are several musicals that we're both kind of like anticipating becoming musicals, but also a little scared to see them become musicals because of these things we've been talking about the modern state of musicals. So it'll be interesting to see how musicals are adapted for film in the future.
Right. I actually want to get some of your hot takes on that, Jonathan. The Wicked musical, is it going to be good? Yes or no?
I can't say for certain either
yes
way.
Or no? Yes or no? We're not looking for a measured opinion right now. We do measured opinions every week, all week on this podcast. I want quick, decisive, irreverent hot takes. Yes or no? Is the Wicked movie going to be good?
I hope so. Does that count?
Close enough. Okay. Will a Hamilton movie be made within the next 15 years?
Absolutely.
Okay, will it be good?
Will the Hamilton musical be good? That one's for you.
Oh gosh.
Here we go. If Lin-Manuel Miranda is involved, will the Hamilton musical be good?
Yes.
If he's not, will it be good?
No, but I guess we're just gonna have to wait for it.
Oh boy. Yep, we're waiting for it. I just hope they don't throw away their shot.
Man.
It was too easy.
Crazy. Too easy. Anyway, what do we have next week on the podcast, Jonathan?
Next week, we have a guest, which we haven't had in a while because we kind of got out of our normal schedule with the world tour. But we have a friend of ours, Benjamin Angrazano, coming on to talk about films made by the Coen brothers. So we're going almost all the way through their career, not some of their very recent things, but we're going to be talking about Blood Simple, their first feature film in 1984, Fargo, one of their big hits from 1996, and No Country for Old Men in 2007, which is available on Netflix.
Yeah, so we're tackling kind of some of the darker side of the Coen brothers.
Yeah, we were very bright and colorful today, and we're getting dark and gritty next week with some crime thrillers.
Yeah, and probably confused.
Yeah, a little bit.
Yeah, that's their signature. But anyway, that's about all the time we have for this episode.
If you have movie suggestions for us or just want to reach out, I can be found on Twitter at @JSSatchel.
And I'm at Alex Geringer.
And to find links to things that we talked about today, you can view them on the blog at thefilmlings.com.
If you like the show, let us know. Leave us a review on iTunes so other people know what we're all about.
We definitely appreciate it.
Talk to you next week.
All right, see ya.
Hot take stew. I take a hot take. You take a hot take. Hot take stew. You take a hot take. You know what to do. Put it in the stew.
The Hot Take Stew.
Coming this summer to Broadway.
Tickets available nowhere.
Thank God.